My mind, my body, and my spirit is dripping in black with love.
Welcome to the Dripping in Black podcast, where we celebrate Black excellence throughout the Black diaspora. Our special guest host is Dominic Lawson from the Black is America podcast.
What's up, good people all across the world? This is the Dripping in Black podcast, and I am your guest host, Dominic Lawson. I'm a multi-award winning podcaster of the critically acclaimed series, Black is America, where we highlight little-known African-American figures and stories. And also just want to, again, thank the man behind the glass at Square for this amazing opportunity to be your guest host. Now, you might enjoy the fit, because I always got to support the merch that we have here at Dripping in Black. And so if you do love what I got going on over here, go to dibkdripshop.com to get this and others. Even a really nice mug that S Square kind of pays us in for being a guest host. Again, that's dibkdripshop.com. But hey, let me get to the task at hand here. She is an award-winning educator, activist, speaker, and author of more than 2 decades of experience engaging in cultivating community with cultural humility, relevance, and responsiveness with joy in the process. She is also a licensed master social worker and professor at New York University Silver Graduate School of Social Work. She's also the author of Celebrate Smiles, which teaches self-esteem, love, and thankfulness to children. She is the wonderful, the amazing Professor Pia Hargrove. Professor P, how are you, ma'am?
I'm doing well this morning. Thank you so much, Dominic.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on the Dripping in Black podcast and being now part of the Dripping in Black family. So before we get into our amazing conversation today, let's ask a really simple, sometimes hard question. Who is Professor Pia?
Uh, so as you gave all the information, I'm a speaker, activist, author, educator, and mom to 2 amazing children, Maple and Sage, and I believe mother figure and mentor to many, and just a Brooklyn girl at heart.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let me say happy belated Mother's Day. And I'm pretty sure you had a great day with your 2 boys there and stuff like that. And you're from BK, huh?
Yes,
Brooklyn.
thank you. Thank you. I have a boy and a girl.
Okay, all right. Oh, sorry, boy and a girl. My apologies.
Okay.
My apologies. Absolutely. So, Professor Pia, let's just kind of get right into it because I know, your background is in social work and things of that nature. So I know mental health is a big part of what you do in your work. Let's just kind of dive right into why you got into this work. What was that process like? Just kind of walk us through those early stages of your work.
Oh, so I would say the early stages of my work really began as a child. So I grew up here in Brooklyn in the 80s, where I think indicative of many urban cities across America, we were really infiltrated with crack cocaine at the time, and just so much violence precipitated from that drug use. We see unfortunate situations going on right now with our opioid crisis and so much overdose that's happening right now with our families and communities. And so just really as a child, having the lens of seeing those that I looked up to, the teenagers that was rocking their Adidas and their Kangol hats, and they were just the coolest with their door knocker earrings, and then watching people really wane away and die, both from the drug addiction, from violence, from just disconnected community and disconnected spirits. And so even from a child, I was clear that there is something more that has to be done to support people in the growing process. And as a mom, it's a little bit of a challenge because I always felt like, parents, caregivers, they have their role, but things have to happen in community in a larger context. And you have to have people that care about you, that are interested in nurturing community. And unfortunately, in my educational journey in the early portion, we didn't necessarily get that nurture in the classroom. Teachers may be invested in teaching you the content, but I didn't always get the nurturing that I felt was critical, not just for me, but for many of my peers and many who are no longer with us in the classroom. So I just felt like as I grew into adulthood, I wanted to be clear in all aspects of the either professional work that I do in my personal life, in any engagement that love, that care, that joy that you mentioned is present.
Absolutely. You mentioned an interesting parallel, from the crack epidemic from back in the 80s and now the opioid crisis. And also you can probably throw fentanyl in there as well as a big issue as well. I'm curious, Professor Pia, how did the crack epidemic growing up in the 80s there in Brooklyn, how did it show up in other places? I mean, obviously there's the drug use, right? But like, how did that show up in like, maybe a kid wasn't able to get proper, a meal or something like that because they, and they're like stuffing their face at lunchtime or stuff like that. What are some of those stories that kind of came out of that era from your lens, Professor Pia?
Absolutely. So, many of our caregivers weren't able to be present, and whether it was physical presence, emotional, spiritual presence, it wasn't there. And then additionally, I mean, that was the era that gave rise to mass incarceration, both in the context of those who may have been selling drugs, which even coming upon that came by all these different channels that we don't often talk about, and then being subsequently incarcerated because of that sale, and then others for the usage of the drugs instead of getting the care and treatment that was necessary were incarcerated. So mass incarceration really deeply affected our generation. So it was a combination of crack usage, crack exposure, incarceration that really just pull families apart and pull communities apart. And when we saw economic development, when we saw a flourishing and burgeoning Black community and the infiltration of crack came in, and there was just so much destruction that continued to precipitate thereafter. And so thankfully, at this point, sometimes when I speak about it, I feel like it's a distant memory that people have no awareness about because we didn't have social media then. We didn't have photographers necessarily capturing the moment. And in some ways, that's a blessing because those are very hurtful and traumatic moments. But at the same time, we can't heal from things that we don't acknowledge. And so it's important to me to acknowledge what our communities across the country have been through, what people who are still living to tell the story have overcome, and also to really extend our hearts and our grief and our mourning and just that care that's necessary for those of us who have lost loved ones, those of us who still have people who are currently incarcerated for many, many years who have come through that time, and healing in the process of that entire journey for all of us.
Gotcha. You mentioned acknowledgement just now, and I imagine with many of the people you work with, the people you speak to on your many speaking engagement, that acknowledgement piece or that denial piece is pretty prevalent, right? How are you able to work through that with a client, with a person you're talking to when they don't want to acknowledge what's going on? Because I imagine that's a big piece of it. In addition to isolation, but that acknowledgement piece is definitely prevalent for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because things are really hurtful and traumatic. So I think when you approach people with love and you approach with that care and you're able to connect, I'm a person that has, endured a lot along with community at the same time. So that's why I think it's important for survivor-led healing, those of us who have come through different communities and experiences, to be ones to connect now in the present. And so it gives a different sort of license or ability in a way to acknowledge the harm that we've experienced when you can really share that you've been through this collectively. And I often get the question, well, how did you make it through? How did you come through these things? So it gives me an opening to be able to share whatever chapter you think you're opening today or who you feel you're meeting today. That does not indicate or give story fully to everything that has come before. And so, there's a saying, I don't look like what I've been through. And that's a blessing, but then also it allows you to have a window to say to people, I know what we've been through. And so that acknowledgement, I'm giving the acknowledgement, even if maybe you're not ready to do so. And that's also okay. Because sometimes that acknowledgement might be something that we can't endure, we're not ready for, maybe we're never ready for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Professor Pia, I know you mentioned before that you from Brooklyn, right? I was just actually in New York and was in Brooklyn for the first time. I actually was able to venture out of Manhattan and go to Brooklyn, and I was very, I really like the how diverse Brooklyn is, or whatever, from different backgrounds, different aspects, different cultures, and this, that, and the other. So I'm curious about this. When you are in the classroom and you're teaching, and I imagine your classroom is diverse as well. How are you able to connect with those different cultures and different backgrounds? Like I understand there's some universal, definitely some things that are universal, but I imagine there's sometimes barriers when you come from different cultures, different backgrounds. So how do you create that culture within your classroom.
Well, that's absolutely true because I do teach at New York University, which is a primarily white institution, but because of the voices of myself and other faculty and student body and other administrators, we are increasingly diverse, but it is a process and a journey. So the most important thing to me is to really come from a place of humanity. So in this past semester, actually, I wrote a piece called What is Your Why, where I speak very vulnerably and candidly about my why, just the things I just shared with you, what brought me to so-called social work practice, which is really a lifestyle as far as I'm concerned. And by sharing that sort of in maybe the first or second class, I'm really putting myself out there in a way, and I don't necessarily know who's in the room. So by modeling that behavior or, sort of sharing openly and honestly, I think it allows the classroom and that space to open up to hear from others in a way that hopefully is non-judgmental and coming with a listening ear, if nothing else, and to allow people to really look inside themselves and do that reflection. So I really call for us all to do that consistent self-reflection of what is our story, what brings us, what is our why, what keeps us going. Sometimes we need to be reactivated around that. And then I also raise that to the group to think about their why. And if they're comfortable to share it, they're welcome to, but if they're not, that's okay. But the important part is to reflect. So once we get in touch with that humanity, the cultural barrier, the so-called intersectional identities of however we may present or people think we represent different groups to the world, that's no longer paramount. It's really what has been your personal experience. And especially when we can get in touch with the duality of that. What are the pains that we've been through, but then what are also the joys? And very often, those are the two areas that we can connect the most deeply with anyone. It doesn't matter what the background is, what country you come from, what your ethnicity is. It is that joy that can be resonant. So we do something else around joy at one part where I actually share from my book, Celebrate Smiles. And then we also talk about what are the hurts, what are the traumas, what are the pains, and how do we move through those things, and how do we access the joy even in the midst of those challenges.
Absolutely. You mentioned your children's book, Celebrate Smiles, and I know it's geared towards uh, children, obviously. But do you often hear about adults maybe picking up this book? Because I know there's this aspect of reparenting and giving ourselves, something we didn't have growing up as a kid. Have you seen where some adults have gotten your book, or maybe some of your teachings or whatever, and that was really geared towards kids, or maybe initially geared towards kids, but like and they'll pick something up for themselves? Have you seen that in your work?
Well, actually, the book is geared toward everyone. It's not really geared toward children for a number
Okay.
of reasons. As a woman of African descent growing up here, there weren't a lot of children's books that really had a main character that reflected my identity, both in how I look or how I express myself. And then in conjunction with that, um, in immigrant communities. So I'm from Flatbush, Brooklyn, which is largely an immigrant community of African descent. So folks from around the entire diaspora, from the Caribbean to Africa to other places in Europe where maybe our people have settled. So it also, and even throughout Brooklyn in general and New York City in general, it's a large immigrant population from around the world. So where English is not necessarily people's first language, and if it is people's first spoken language, they're not always literate in that language. They're not always literate in English. And if people are literate, because of the intensity of the working, especially in New York City, it is almost a privilege and a luxury for parents to have that time to sit down and read to their children on a regular basis, and also to be read to have also grown up and had the experience to be read to on a regular basis. So I just found a children's book is a beautiful way to make that continued connection, both for adults and children, but also for that adult to have the experience to maybe read out loud or be read to by their child in a way that they may or may not have experienced, especially with a book that may reflect their identity as mine. So, for example, in the book, the little girl has a do-rag on her head because so many times, even in current media, I see Black women and girls going to bed and there is no head wrap, there's no do-rag, there's no bonnet. And I'm saying, wow, I guess they're taking Beyonce serious that we just woke up like this. But Some people do, but a lot of us don't. And even head coverings, when we look at our world journey, people around the world, especially those who identify as women, often cover their head for a multitude of reasons, whether that's spiritual, religious, or, keeping your hair intact. But it is a reality that many of us experience, but it's not always presented in media and in books and in children's books. So that's one piece. But for example, the book closes with every day that you awake with thankfulness inside, your inner beauty can be shown with a big, bright smile outside. And that message is for all of us to remember. That in any language in the world, a smile is always heard, is on one of the other pages. So again, thinking about this international community, this global community that we're a part of because of social media in so many ways, and being very intentional about that messaging throughout the book.
Absolutely. Professor Pia, it's amazing how powerful a smile can be. I remember being in a sales job where the manager would tell us to smile while we were on the phone, making phone calls and stuff like that. And people can just naturally hear a difference in your voice, even if they can't see you. Just by smiling, you can definitely tell a difference. So I can definitely appreciate that sentiment for sure. Once again, people, you are listening to the Driven in Black podcast. We are have the amazing honor to have Professor Pia here with us. Professor P, I know you do many speaking engagements, and I know you do like a mental health segment on a radio show, The Reset. And I listened to the latest one where you was talking about domestic violence abuse and stuff like that. Just kind of dive into what you were sharing with that audience on that day for that segment.
Oh, wow. Yes, so the Reset Talk Show, the host is J.R. Giddings, and I have a mental health First Friday segment. So every first Friday of the month. So the next one will be, let me check my dates, will be Friday, June 7th. So you're welcome to tune in to the Reset Talk Show. So just speaking, that show really caters to the Caribbean diaspora, the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. It's sort of rooted here in New York as well, with many of the folks really representing many countries throughout the Caribbean. And so we talk very deeply and candidly about domestic violence, particularly in gender-based violence, violence against women in homes that is unfortunately perpetuated, that can be taught sometimes, especially by some of our religious and spiritual leaders. And so just really giving people knowledge and awareness and raising the comfort level, at least awareness to speak about some of the things that we keep closed behind closed doors, and give information about really accessing help. So in New York City, which is a sanctuary city, both women or anyone that's affected by domestic violence certainly has rights here to be able to speak out against that, be able to get possible, temporary housing. It may not be the best, but to get safety, and to also provide for our children. All children have access to education here, free education, regardless of immigration status of the adults in the home. So even giving information of that sort, because many times people are concerned that if they leave the person who is causing harm in a city that's so very expensive, that it'll be very difficult to survive thereafter. I'm not saying it will be easy, but to at least think about the ways in which you can secure your safety and get some supports from external factors, and make sure that your children are in school, if they're of school age, and also healthcare. So again, in New York City in particular, regardless of immigration status, children always have a right to health care, which is something, when domestic violence presents itself, these are some issues that really come up for why people may, I won't say choose, they may feel it's not an option to leave when harm is being caused in the home. So that's in relationship to domestic violence, and thinking about our community in particular, some of the things that have come up in the mental health segment. So thinking about our mental health holistically, it's not just how we're feeling. Sometimes they're the facts of what's taking place in our environment. We're a person in an environment. We don't stand alone from the environment. So It's also taking sometimes the onus off of feeling that something is wrong with me, and really acknowledge again that there are things going on in your environment that create a situation that maybe is extremely challenging, but what are the other aspects of our environment that we can bring support so that people can begin to overcome some of those challenges, and we do that collectively.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you kind of alluded to some of that just now, but I really appreciate it in that segment where you talked about how, it's not just physical abuse that often takes place in the facet of domestic abuse. There's the financial abuse. There's other type of abuse. There's, keeping people, isolating them so they can't be with their family as well. And it really just goes to show that like these things really are like not necessarily a ticking time bomb, but also like a minefield because you just never know how it will show up. So I appreciate that piece on sharing about those different faces of domestic abuse. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Professor Pia, which is related to that. I've been hearing a lot about this idea of betrayal trauma, right? We have a lot of different like relationship podcasts and marriage podcasts and stuff like that. And this idea of betrayal trauma of like somebody doing something, whether they're cheating, whether they're doing something else, and that partner is betrayed, and there's trauma from that. Can you speak to that at all, and just kind of give some perspective on that a little bit?
That's not really a term that I'm familiar with. I haven't betrayal trauma.
Okay.
I mean, I know what betrayal is and I know what trauma is. And I think as human beings, sometimes that's what we do. Sometimes we inflict the betrayal and sometimes we are the ones betrayed. And I think in my own, I'll speak in I statements as I teach my students. In I statements in my own journey, I've come to understand that we embody all aspects of humanity at different points in our lives, even those that are very uncomfortable. And as we're intentional about our own self-care holistically and loving ourselves profoundly and deeply before we can think about how we love others, we have to also recognize if we have been harmed excessively and betrayed to a point that we feel that our dignity has been attempted to be robbed of us, or we have been humiliated, or we have been physically injured in such a way that now we may have paralysis or we may have permanent damage, then we also have to decide to love ourselves in a way to move from that and to access the community care that's necessary. And also, it's a call to action for all of us to be the community that also can step in for loved ones and friends when we see what's going on and lend that hand, and not be concerned about finances. I think sometimes we don't help or we don't want to extend ourselves. We're thinking about money. Help doesn't always look like money. So it's like, what are things that we can do that we are building community around us, so when we are in these despondent situations that we have others that can help pull us out? Because I know I've had some people to pull me out of some muck and mire that I was not able to even recognize that I was in. And so it takes community to be able to do that. And that's a growing process for all of us, because sometimes our pride keeps us, you know, that we don't tell anybody what's happening and we can walk around and present that everything's fine. And we're not able to get the help that we need because people don't acknowledge it. They don't know. So it's
Absolutely.
really being intentional about the roots crew, as I call it. Who is your roots crew? Who are the people that hold you accountable when you need to be held accountable, but also that really pour true love and care into you, not with insult, not with the backhanded slap, but really sincerity. And that grows and changes over time. It's not always the same people. So when we talk about betrayal, sometimes that's a recognition that the season that you've been in maybe is now coming to a close and it's time to step into a new one. And it's challenging. It's a faith walk. But trust, when you do step into that new season, whoever and whatever needs to come into your environment to cultivate you in that space will be there. And I'm saying that from experience. So there's no way you can't prove that to someone when they're in the challenging point. But that's why our testimonies are important for people to at least have an inkling of belief that they can get there. And I'm saying that from an experience. When you've had the betrayal point and when you feel like, well, if I leave this garden, I don't know what's going to be in the other one. But guess what? You've been in the garden of dandelions, which, depending on the beholder, are weeds. You've been in dandelions, they're yellow, they pop up, they have the little wishes that we love to blow when we're little. But if you're willing to step into the next garden, guess what? That yellow dandelion is no longer, what do you have? Sunflowers that grow almost as tall as a building. But you have to be willing to step into that next garden to find out. And only when someone's been in that other garden, they can tell you that it's real. It's real. And you have to trust it and come to the other side.
And honestly, Professor Pia, that's kind of where I was getting at, right? Because I think it's important for, I know many people who are going through mental health challenges, they sometimes lash out, right? Or they cheat on a spouse, or they hit a spouse, or they abuse a spouse in some kind of way, or a friend or a loved one, or whatever that looks like. And I don't know if we hear enough about that person's story. We hear about the person who did the lashing out, but not the person who's on the receiving end. And it speaks to that testimony piece that you were talking about. And you were talking also about acknowledgement, and you also talked about modeling in the classroom. If you don't mind me asking this, Professor Pia, you talked about from your personal experience, how did it, and as comfortable as you feel like sharing, how did your Roots crew show up for Professor Pia? What did that look like? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Oh, when I was in my dandelion field?
Yeah, yes.
Wow. I mean, it literally looked like, well, I guess on the base level, friends that would call and check in regularly and see, how are you doing? Not how are children doing? How are you actually doing? What do you need? How can I support you? It looked like, maybe when I was kind of isolated from that, it looked like friends maybe sending cards in the mail, maybe sending a text message that even if I didn't respond, they still send it again anyway. It looked like maybe a friend popping up unannounced and being willing to just extend themselves in that way, even if I wasn't ready for a visit. It looked like friends driving from out of state to help me move out of one place into another, and pack up things. It looked like friends bringing groceries unannounced, again, something that I didn't ask for, but just thinking about what might this person need. So it looked a lot of different ways. It looked a lot of different ways.
And I think that speaks to something you were saying earlier, that sometimes support is not just monetary, right? It's actually showing up for that person in those many different myriad of ways. I've talked to many people who they'll say, hey, let me just go get your groceries for you today, or
Mhm.
let me go do this for you today. And that meant more than just, then more than $50 or whatever. Like
Absolutely.
that meant so much more because they actually sometimes literally showed up for that person. And so I think that can go a long way. So thank you for sharing that, Professor Pia. And so I know, in addition to your talks and stuff like that, another reoccurring theme is self care in the things that you express. Kind of walk us through that and kind of talk about the type of self care that you do, but also maybe those unconventional types of self care. Because I know as a man, I'm thinking self care has to be a bubble bath and this, that, and the other. But self care can look like different ways to different people, right?
Oh yeah. Self-care just can look like making sure you eat, because that's something that I was challenged with actually just yesterday. I get so I'm a creative. So I get really involved in my work in this creative way sometimes. And I think of it, I definitely like make jewelry, I make things as well. And sometimes my work is the same. So I might have books and articles and journals. I might have the laptop open, two journals open. And then I get so involved that I forget to eat. I literally will forget to eat. And by the time I remember to eat, is because my body is reacting to not having been physically fed. So remembering scheduling an alarm or something to make sure to eat when I get in that mode is important for me. That is self-care, because if I'm not fed, and it's not that I don't have food or don't have access to food, then whose fault is that? That's my own. So as simple as meeting our basic needs of eating, sleeping, you know, getting outside and taking walks. So that's something that I'm intentional about doing. I also acknowledge we don't all live in walkable communities that are safe. So if, walking outside definitely may equal gun violence, you have to assess. But then thinking about where are the places that you can get that outside experience in a way that's safe and that can kind of give you that awareness that the sun shines every day. The moon comes out every night, no matter where we are. So even that, like I try to intentionally look for the moon at night. I look for the sun every day. I look for the flowers when I'm taking my walk. I look for the trees when I'm taking my walk. And when I've been in communities where the trees aren't present, the flowers aren't present, I've applied for grants to get funding to be able to purchase, bulbs, daffodil bulbs and all these things, and do planting and bring community together, bring neighbors together to do neighborhood planting. Because I acknowledge also in our communities of color, city budgets are often very disparate, and the same city budget for some reason does not make it to our communities. And so you have to, really be active in activating that money to come into community, get the resources that we all deserve. So some of the ways of, walking, eating, trying to take care of my body, feeding my mind, feeding my ears. So I have intentionally shifted the music that I've listened to probably over the past like 10 years, which I will admit was inspired by becoming a mom. I was like, I don't know if I could listen to all this bumping in the car the same way. But then I recognized that once I change what I'm feeding through my ears, that's also what's going in my mind. That's what's going in my spirit. That's what's going in my heart. So being intentional about the music we listen to. Thank you for Dripping in Black, the podcast we're listening to. If we aren't literate, then are we listening to podcasts that are feeding our intellect? Are we listening to books now that we have access to Audible and these other platforms to gain knowledge through listening? So just being intentional and expansive about the ways that we take care of ourselves. I also definitely have a spiritual practice. I pray. I read, the Bible. I read the Christian Bible. And whether or not you believe that's a myth or a truth, I find most ancient texts will also provide ancient wisdom. So if you only view that as secular, that's fine too. But access some text that you do feel feeds you, whatever that looks like for you. I think that's important. And again, because of the technology, we can also listen to a lot of these texts. So praying, meditating. I take time to meditate as well daily. And then I try to put more time into that on my weekends, both worship and meditating, and really being grounded and getting clarity on my thoughts and my purpose, and am I stepping in purpose?
Absolutely. I love that meditation piece. That's definitely something I've been trying to work on adding into the self-care kind of palette, if you will. And speaking of your creativity, those earrings, are those a creation of yours
I
as
didn't
well?
actually make these, no, but I do make a lot of my own things.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So I just wanted to give that acknowledgement if it was, so to make sure I was
Thank you.
doing that. You mentioned, Professor Pia, about sometimes in communities of color, certain resources are sometimes not there, or they're there and or they're there and they're taken away. And I came across a study of how I think for like every 476 high schools or something like that, there's one guidance counselor, if you will. And it made me think back to a story when I was a kid where I had like anger management issues, and I was seeing a guidance counselor, and I was learning those self-regulation tips and stuff like that. And I remember the end of second grade, she was like, "Okay, Dominic, I want you to work on this over the summer, and when you come back next year for third grade, we're gonna build upon these things, right?" But over the summer, funding got cut, guidance counselor gone, right? And I don't think I got those self-regulation tips until I started going to therapy as an adult. So I went this big part of my life not knowing how to regulate my emotions and things of that nature. I say all of that to ask you this.
Mm.
Um, because we know when it comes to the classroom and not having enough support, mental health challenges are still there in the classroom, especially for those of us who are people of color. How do you advise teachers and parents to kind of, obviously teachers do enough, right? Obviously, right? And I hate to kind of put more on them, but how do you give them advice if they want to help foster a positive mental health culture, classroom, whether it comes to teachers or parents in the
Yeah.
home?
Ooh, well, you're saying a lot kind of in these two questions, because you started with the self-care for yourself as a man and the challenges around that. And now you're coming to the classroom. And what comes to mind is James Baldwin, who said to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious, which you definitely are, is to be in a rage almost all the time. So again, acknowledging this person and environment. You're not acting out and doing all these things for no reason. There's usually something going on, whether it's in your awareness of what injustices might be present around you, whether that's at home, in the classroom, on your walk to school, on your subway ride, whatever that looks like. And it's dangerous in so many ways to not call that out for our children and for people, to at least speak to what's happening on a day-to-day basis. So I realize our teachers, they pour into our children so much, and they have these competencies that they have to meet by virtue of Department of Education or whatever city you're in standards. So it does not give room for the other piece. But that check-in is so important, even at the beginning, at the end of the day, just sometimes to see, even if you can only do it once in a while. I do it even in my classroom with adults. Let's check in. How are people doing? What's going on? Because then it gives you the awareness as the educator, what are some of the other barriers that might be present that this person is not listening to what you're saying, not out of disrespect or not out of, you know, just being a complete disregard for the classroom, but there are other things happening. So that check-in is important. If it's not able to be done in the classroom, if our caregivers out there can do it, even if it's in a moment, if it's in the quick, when I'm with my daughter on the train, that's when we kind of do our check-in. So what's been going on? How are you feeling? What happened in class yesterday, today? What are you looking forward to? What are you upset about? Find out what's happening with the child. And then when it comes to the guidance counselor, often our guidance counselors are charged with really doing classroom scheduling, the schedules for classes, not really the emotional support that I think many of our guidance counselors wanted to do, and that's why they entered the profession, but it's not often what the task that's given to them in the settings. So we really just need more social workers, more psychologists, more guidance counselors in our schools, which are really overcrowded. We have a lot of children in our schools without these levels of support. So I do this, in my political activism. Part of that is advocating on the city level, if you're in a city or whatever your environment is, if it's a town, for more social workers and psychologists and guidance counselors in the schools, because there's really just not enough to serve the needs. Even if everyone walks in that school every day emotionally healthy, to get us really aligned and foster and grow the purpose that is in each child, we don't have the support to do that. So again, I don't want to say it's the child or the teacher or that guidance counselor. We need more. We need more. And the money is clearly present in all of our cities in many cases, because we see money being allocated in other areas, but not being allocated to our schools for social workers and guidance counselors and psychologists. So I have to put that out there for anyone out there who's our activist, really bring that budget to our children. We like to say children will lead us. We like to say our children are our future. But in a country where one of our main tools of capitalism is capital, and we don't invest that money in those minds, cultivating not just the intellect, but the emotional readiness, then we're not doing our due diligence. So that's definitely a piece. And then for our men, since you mentioned it, and for our children and for our communities, those of us who identify as part of the African diaspora, we still have a pretty intense stigma around mental health and mental support. And you got the sharp haircut, I get my hair done, we take care of these external parts of our body. So if you can't, don't think of it as, oh, something's wrong, or, there's something wrong with so-and-so. It's the same way we cultivate and take care and groom our exterior. We should be doing even more on the interior. So if you have to think of it that way, the same way you go for your medical checkups, at least annually, sometimes more, that's the same we should be doing for our mind. Marcus Garvey taught us that our mind is sovereign. That intellect that we bring as a people, that's what was tried to be taken from us, right? When our names were taken, during the transatlantic, one of the first things was to remove our names, to remove the knowledge that we had from the continent. So that goes to show that mind is extremely powerful. If someone would go through such extreme measures to remove the knowledge from our minds and then keep us in disparate educational systems throughout, then that in itself should be confirmation. This must be a powerful thing if someone's invested in keeping it from us. So then we need to be intentional about feeding our minds in all ways. And that is also taking care of that mind through mental health. So if you are having mental health challenges, please certainly seek a therapist, mental health professional. In our public hospitals, you can access mental health care, based on your immigration status. I realize every city is very different, but for free or sliding scale or, billing through Medicaid or like healthcare. And if you have private insurance, usually on the back, you will see mental health copay. So utilize that the same way you want to make sure your feet are ready for summer. Utilize your mental health care as well. And if you are in a good place in your life and you're saying, I don't have any issues, that's an even better state to be in for mental health support, because you can take that very stable and healthy moment that you're in and really be intentional about edifying and elevating to the next level, getting aligned with purpose, not thinking about just your professional role, but how do you want to expand your spirit in your personal life? How do you need to also be supported? Because when we have that clarity, sometimes we can get in better touch with that. But certainly when we have people that are, you mentioned acting out as a child, if we have adults in our home that are really causing harm, that are beating us up, that are physically harming us, that are abusing substances, alcohol, other drugs and substances in a way that is really interfering into not only their daily lives, but those around them, then we need to seek the care. If you had a broken leg and the bone was protruding, you would go to the ER. So it's the same thing with our minds. When we are not able to be healthy enough to be around and we become dangerous, please, you need to utilize the care that's available. Mental health support, emergency room visit if it's something in acute that either you are able to go, and if you're at a space where you're not able to bring yourself, then that's something that family, friends, whoever's around, if people are still around, can bring you to. In New York City, we have what's called ACT teams. So people in active acute psychosis in the streets or otherwise are too dangerous for family members to even be around them. There are ACT teams that will come out and really come and get the person for that care that's necessary. So I don't want us sitting and listening in a moment of harm and not addressing it because we're worried about stigma or what are people going to think. We want to be able to think something because you're alive. So that's the most important piece.
Absolutely, and I appreciate all of those resources and things of that nature. And if I could just add one more, call or text 988 if you have somebody you want to talk to. That's free, confidential, 24/7 access to talk to somebody as well. Thank you so much for that, Professor Pia. And Dripping in Black family, we are starting to wrap up with Professor Pia here on the Dripping in Black podcast. Professor Pia, I'm curious, what's next for you? I think I've heard things of political aspirations and things of that nature, and also I know restorative justice is also a piece that's important to you. What's next for Professor Pia and the work that she does?
Just continuing to sort of share knowledge in community with folks, especially around our diaspora. Looking forward, most recently coming up, I mentioned the Reset Talk Show on Friday, June 7th, Saturday, June 8th. I'm excited. I'll be receiving one of the Reset Appreciation Awards here in New York City. So if you're around, it would be wonderful to see you there. We have the Roots Crew Experience. I have an online community called the Roots Crew where we meet monthly on Zoom to address some of our mental health needs, but it's done in a collective environment, but really focused on our personal growth and evolution. So it's a beautiful community where we speak to different issues like accessing that self-love and peace and care for ourselves. And then coming up in June, I am incredibly, incredibly, incredibly honored to give the keynote address for the National Association of Social Workers, the New York State chapter's national conference. So that will be on Wednesday, June 5th, and Wednesday, June 6th. I will be presenting a workshop, which folks are welcome to attend. You can check the NASW website, and it is called Color Me Well, Mental Health and Racial Trauma. So I'll be speaking actually more about our healing journey, especially of those who identify as of African descent, of how we begin this healing journey from the racial trauma that we experience on a daily basis. And then looking forward to some outreach in the island of Trinidad later this summer and really engaging communities around economic development, around educational wealth in different ways, and how we are continuing to create our legacy and do so in community in ways in which that we know as people around the world, much of our experiences have been taken from us through colonization of different forms. And so the island of Trinidad, I'll be there sharing with a large community there that has some challenges to economic growth and development. And so be fostering entrepreneurship and community there, and really working with children around educational development in an area that has, somewhat lower literacy than other places, but that's not the only way that we communicate. We communicate through many forms. So just being intentional about bringing that knowledge and awareness and sharing it in community with others and learn. I'm excited to learn so much from all of these journeys with people that are just actually wonderful. So looking forward to
Absolutely.
all of it. So you can stay tuned for it. I'm on Instagram, Professor Pia, and my website is professorpia.com. So if you want to get in touch with me, that is the best way to do so and kind of stay up to date with the things that are happening.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of that. And congratulations on all of that. Sounds amazing. There you have all the things you have on your slate, if you will. I want to ask you something really quickly, though, because you mentioned racial trauma, right? Because we have people in an era of rewriting history books and saying certain things didn't happen and this that, and the other. And so when I talk to people about racial trauma, there are often people who say racial trauma, it's not a thing, that's not real, this that, and the other. How do you address those objections when you hear that, Professor Pia?
I think that comes back to what you asked earlier about engaging people, especially in the classroom, when they do represent different cultures, because when we access our humanity and we can acknowledge experiences where any aspect of our identity has allowed us to experience harm. And that's a question that I ask. Think back to a time where any aspect of your identity, whether it's gender, culture, spirituality, sexual expression, race, ethnicity, that you have experienced something negative because of it, and just leave it at that. And then I also ask people to think about a time that you were celebrated or something felt incredibly prideful based on any or some of those intersectional identities. When we can access that aspect of humanity, then we build the empathy. But sometimes it's just challenging. If someone has not experienced something, it's hard to tell what your experience is if they don't feel it. So you really have to access the empathy and also give grace, to folks. Not everyone, I don't know what it is to be a man. So you might tell me something and maybe I don't get it and you're frustrated, but I just don't know. But if you ask me to think about something that I can feel, and then you say, well, it's not exactly the same, but just how you feel, that's how I felt in this experience of being a man, then we can begin the connection. But only when we're able to even have these open conversations can we even get there. Because if we're not communicating, we're not, interacting with people that don't reflect us necessarily, it's not going to happen. So I'm just really invested in us being in a true global community, because the more we access our humanity, the more we do that. And if we are saying that race is a construct, then we can't get stuck on it at the same time. We have to move past it. That's the only way we can transcend it, is when we all just get in touch with our humanity and build the empathy from that space. I also wanted to say, you had mentioned about, never mind, go ahead, sorry.
Are you sure?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. Okay. If it comes back up, please don't
Yeah.
hesitate to let me know what that is. So I am about to get to the last question, and so I want to make sure we get that on wax. S Square is going to have something for you here, so I'm going to buy him a little time and ask this last question for you. A little something we like to give all of our dripping in black community. You mentioned earlier about being the ongoing, ever learning learner, if you will, right? In your profession, in your work, and Professor P, you have many accolades to your name, right? You've done quite a few things in your work, but even you talk about I'm still learning, still evolving. Talk about why that's so important and what that looks like for Professor Pia.
Oh, actually, one of my good friends, Brooke McFerrin, said to me, Brooke Bancroft, she said, "Oh, you love school." And I said, "I don't love school." And she said, "What do you mean?" "Yes, you do." I said, and she said, "Well, you don't love school, you love learning." And I think that's true. I do love learning, and I really experienced learning in every morsel of life. And I just think that that helps me to continue to be in access with my joy, because it's fun to me. It's fun to meet people, to engage, to connect, to travel, to go new places, even throughout Brooklyn, or where, where I'm rooted. It's just so important to me. And I just want to share that. And, I know not everyone feels the same way, but, it's just something that I experience. So I'm always happy to share it with those who are willing to engage.
I heard that. Those who are willing to engage. I think that's a very important piece there. So listen, like I said, you have many accolades to your name. You've done amazing work throughout your career. I know you've been on radio, you've given talks, you've given a national keynote here this summer. That's amazing. But we wanted to give you something here at Dripping in Black to reflect our appreciation of not only coming on the show, but also the work that you do. So S Squared is getting that pulled up here for you. Like I said, it's just a way to commemorate, saying thank you so much for coming on the Dripping in Black podcast. Put you on the front of a magazine cover
Oh
there.
my
So
gosh, thank you.
yes, absolutely. S Squared does a really good job of getting fantastic photos of the people that come through. And so we wanted to make sure that we commemorate your time here on Dripping in Black. And so he'll be sending that out to you here in the coming weeks. So that way you can have that memento as well. What do you think?
Thank you. Shout out to Broadway. I was literally walking down Broadway. And that was a couple weeks ago, believe it or not. New York stays cold. So even though it's springtime, yeah, scarf and coat is still necessary. So I was walking down Broadway and I was passing a store and it had all these flowers outside. And I was like, oh, we'll just take a selfie here. So it's completely impromptu. So thank you for grabbing that pic.
No, I love that. And thank you for that story for that pic. Now you just given me a whole new segment to kind of do something with, with the pictures that we give and the covers we give here on Dripping in Black. So thank you so much for that. So listen, Professor Pia, any last words you want to share and grace our audience with before we let you go for today?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I just hope that, all the listeners are just encouraged to continuously access your joy. So just think about, what are the things in your life, even when you were little, that brought you joy? If you think about it as I call it my sensory joy journey. So what does joy smell like? What does joy taste like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? So think about those things and just try to access them as much as possible, because we're all going to go through things. It's part of being alive. And I want to hear and see you alive in the future. So anyone out there that is thinking about ending their life in this moment, I hope that you're inspired to keep going and reach out to the person that possibly you can trust, or someone else who's listening, reach out to the person that maybe you think doesn't want to continue to live, and just tell them you appreciate them and you look forward to hearing from them and seeing them again. And that's important. So stay alive, stay blessed, access your joy, and always do so with love.
I love that. Thank you so much. Did you remember that thing you wanted to, or you decided not to?
I think I was thinking about suicidality, actually, but I thought that was heavy, so I left you with that message just now.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you, like I said, thank you so much, Professor Pia, for coming on the Dripping in Black show. And thank you, listeners, for diving into this newest edition of the Dripping in Black podcast. Make sure you hit up Professor Pia on her Instagram, on her website, and everything that she mentioned. We have that there in the show notes for easy access. Also, remember to go to the Dripping in Black shop, DIBKDripshop.com, to get this amazing piece of gear that I have. I want to say thank you again to S Squared for letting me be a guest host here. And more importantly, thank you, Dripping in Black family. Allow me to serve you in this role. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting. And thank you for subscribing, because I know you did that here as well. Until next time, be kind, be excellent on purpose. It's a choice. Keep it black, y'all. Peace.
Much appreciation goes out to the Ambiance Media Group for their special contribution to this episode, with a special thanks to Miss D. Allen. Visit their website at www.ambiancemediagroup.com and follow them on social media at Ambiance Media Group.
You have just experienced a Dripping in Black production.